Yeah, I guess I'll wait to start officially till it's out. But also, since I'm back here, if at any point people can't really hear what I'm saying, just let me know, because I'm sitting next to this warm but buzzing machine.
Okay.
Is it ready?
Kayla Anderson.
Okay, so, hi.
Hi.
So Grace asked me to talk about the Anthropocene and also to involve how it relates to gender and race. And so one way that I decided to do that, especially because of how I approach it, is through art practices. So I'll be talking about the work of a lot of different artists and kind of how, and they're not, I'll preface that they're not necessarily making their work saying that they're talking about this concept, but that I see it in the way that they work, or that I think their work is useful. This is the title of another type of work I interact with a lot on a day-to-day basis. So I just want to say there's a lot of, it's not like a spectrum of media of artists working across the board, but just works that I've found really useful in thinking. Let's see. So, sorry, the computer's a little slow. Okay. So I added a lot of slides at the beginning, and I'm just kind of curious how many people already have a grasp of, because I feel like this concept is sort of like something that we're all getting beaten over the head with about the Anthropocene. But I've sort of drawn it out because I want us to actually talk about what that is and what it means and what we might want it to mean. But I found this quote that I thought was really appropriate for what we're doing here in this book that's called Learning to Die in the Anthropocene by Roy Scranton. And so he's saying that as we're threatened by mass extinction, we should build arcs, not just biological arcs in the sense of these preservation concerns and these seed vaults and things that are being built, but also thinking about our things we've developed in different human cultures and wisdom and knowledge and what we might want to save and what we might want to pull out. And so I think that for me with this presentation and the way that I'm looking at both theorists and artists is kind of pulling on these different things that I want us to dwell on. So yeah. So first off, since this is sort of the main concept in my presentation, let's talk about what the Anthropocene is. And again, apologies if this is something that feels really basic to you, but I think it's good to define. So the Anthropocene, and which is for the most part I'm sort of responding to in this presentation, was a concept named by a Dutch chemist in 2001, or 2000. And it's actually kind of strangely taken a long time in my opinion because it's 2017 now, as it sort of trickles in from the sciences and then into the humanities and the arts. But what it is a proposed name of our epoch, so not a future epoch, but the one that we're in now. That's meant to point to the effects that humans have had on the Earth on a geological scale. So looking at sort of the stratigraphy of the Earth and seeing where can we see how humans have altered the geology of the planet. I want to point out a few things that it's not, or what that doesn't mean, and this is sort of a thing up for contention. But it doesn't mean that, or it's not intended to mean, Paul Crutzen term was meant to really kind of point to human impact on climate change. It wasn't meant to say that humans are in control of the planet, or we have full control over how we change the Earth. And it's not meant to be a triumphant epoch. It's meant to really be a way of accepting the weight of our systems. And so there is this sort of camp of people who are calling it the good Anthropocene, like they think of it in a positive way, and maybe similar to the kind of things we were talking about with Biosphere 2 of people who maybe think like, oh, we can control this, or we can geoengineer this sort of thing. We're in control. It's good that humans have had this big of an impact. So that's sort of an opposing camp within this theory. So there are also several different names and proposals for what this, if we are to name this epoch, what it would be called. And it's a little, it's still kind of strange because this decision was supposed to be made, I think, in the last year. The International Commission on Stratigraphy met and had a working group for over a year trying to decide if we should accept this new epoch. And so far, everything I looked to, I haven't found if they made any announcements. But these are other proposals that people have put forth in terms of, since the idea of calling our epoch the Anthropocene is to point to these impacts, some people propose that we should really look more specifically of, maybe it's not all humans that have caused this impact, which humans or what systems. And so, of course, we have the first one up there is the Capitalocene, pointing to the effects of capitalism, also the effects of colonialism and plantations. And then I want to talk a little bit about Nicholas Mirzov, who has a really great essay that's called "It's Not the Anthropocene," and it's not a good name, but it's the white supremacy scene, saying really, it's not. It's a complicated thing when you're saying it's the anthropos, because then it's grouping all of humanity into having this negative impact, when really these things that we're looking at in the Earth's stratosphere are causes of colonialism, are causes of capitalism. And so it's important to recognize which of us contribute more, and then who will suffer more, because they're not the same people. And so, and then at the bottom over here, this little kind of proposal, another proposal that's been put forward for naming is the Cthulhucene, which is from Donna Haraway. And there's been other, and there are more kind of coming out that are sort of along these same lines. But the proposal for the Cthulhucene is not sort of in our present, like these other things are, our present and past, but is something that we want to move towards in the future. So Haraway sort of says, okay, well, what happens once we recognize, or if we recognize we're in the Anthropocene? Do we want to stay in it, or is it something we want to move out of as quickly as possible? And so she proposes this as an epoch. And it's funny, again, to talk in epochs in such a massive scale, but a proposal for the flourishing of multi-species assemblages, which also, and I like the way she phrases it, that also include people. So similar to what some were saying earlier of, it's not just us. We tend to think of extinction as if like the whole world is just going to end, but really we're thinking of ourselves ending. There are other species, unfortunately some that we would take out with us. The world will be very different. But kind of thinking of how we can promote flourishing across species. So each of these different names cues to a different start date, and this is something that's necessary to really name an epoch. You can't just say, oh, the Holocene ended and now we're in the Anthropocene. You have to say, when did it end? And when in Earth's stratigraphy, where would we place that? So they place what's called a golden spike. That's sort of the shortened version of it, but kind of looking in effects on Earth's stratigraphy of when this new epoch would start. And so these are some proposals. So some people propose 8,000 years ago with agriculture, of looking how humans are starting to shape the Earth. Another proposal is antiquity and these multiple empires. And I think personally the one that to me is the most encompassing and the most important is colonialism. Because the first two, there's not really a clear mark. Or there are marks, but they're not as, whereas because of mass genocide as well as the bubonic plague and spreading of all these different species of plants and animals across vastly different environments, there is this sort of huge mark scene. And so those are just some kind of immediate effects that are in their stratigraphy. And then I think that, of course, this continues to a lot of the kind of later marks that people have proposed, which is the Industrial Revolution. This one is more tied to people proposing the Capitalocene, looking at our dependence on fossil fuels and extraction. And then actually, though, I think the one that the Commission wants to propose, or is the most, or that they proposed, it hasn't been agreed on yet, is nuclear detonation, because that's also something that we can see. But that places it quite late, so we have to think about, and I'm proposing, I obviously know we're not the ones deciding this, but I think in terms of it's more useful as a tool for thinking than as a tool for naming. So thinking of, I think where we place it is really important in deciding how we address this. So I'm also totally not using my notes, which is nice. So I hope I don't leave out anything. So just kind of looking at that timeline, another thing I want to talk about is that often the Anthropocene is referred to as a less political version of climate change, but I really think it has to be political in order to be useful, and I think it is. And I think the part of it that's really political comes in that pointing dates of when we decide that this started, when we decide that the changes that humans were making were becoming destructive on this level. And so I also want to bring up environmental racism and slow violence. So ways that the effects of climate change, which is sometimes the Anthropocene is kind of used as another way to say climate change. They're not exactly the same, but it's sort of pointing to climate change. But that climate change is inherently racial, because the effects of climate change will affect communities of color as well as poor communities a lot more. And so going back to the idea of who is the anthropos, we have to think of who is it that's enacting this change and this damage, and then who's experiencing it. And it's not like a cut and dry line of someone is, doing something and someone else, but we're all contributing in different ways. And so I just kind of pulled out some of the effects of the dates before. So looking at colonialism as well as the Industrial Revolution, nuclear detonation, and kind of looking at where the runoff and the effects of those things exist and how they exist, and then some examples of how they affect different communities. And then now to get into some of the art. And so I'll just kind of bring in the work of artists as a way for us to think of this in a more tangible way. But a work that really kind of struck with this to me is a series of photographs and also a book by Latoya Ruby Frazier, who's an artist working in Chicago where I live, called The Notion of Family, where she looks at her hometown of Braddock, Pennsylvania, where everyone is affected by the sort of mining and environmental destruction in terms of both physically and the environment, and then in their bodies. And so this is a spread from her book. I guess it's kind of hard to read. Yeah, I don't know if anyone can read that. But she's talking about the chemicals. Yeah, the chemicals that are in the land and the water and the air because of this industry, and how they're also in their bodies. And so that's something that we'll talk about throughout, is recognizing that the stuff that we do, the stuff that we put out there, unlike what people used to think in terms of early bomb testings. My grandfather was used in a lot of early bomb testings, and they were told to just turn around and cover their eyes while the bomb was dropped behind them in the water, and then they were, yeah, pretty crazy. And then later they would shower with that water, they would drink that water, because no one at the time knew, or the people who knew maybe weren't communicating that. It's always a question of who actually, if we really don't know. But so, there's been a long history of sort of putting these things out there, putting them underground, and thinking that they're contained and that they don't then enter our bodies. And so on the previous slide, that's sort of talking about, these do enter our bodies, and they continue to have effects generationally, and how we survive in the world. And so Latoya Ruby Frazier in the spread is kind of, she's listing these chemicals, and then the photograph is of her after finding out that she had lupus, which is a common health condition in this neighborhood, as well as lots of cancers. because of these chemicals. And so the book is sort of exploring the ties between her own body and the bodies of her mother and her family and the landscape. And so how we really have to look at ourselves as not so separate. When we have these industrial waste sites next to us, they're kind of reaching into every part of our lives. I really like this spread. And this is another work by an artist named Inez Estrada that I kind of, it's a little tongue-in-cheek, but it's a book called Sixman Extinction. And so I want to pull this in because we often think of the idea of the Anthropocene and climate change as then relating to extinction. And so a lot of people are saying we're in the midst of a six-mass extinction. And I think the reason I brought in, and this is a book, so this is just 2 pages from it, the first page and the last page, is I think something that does in terms of thinking that we're in the midst of an extinction is it causes us to kind of put out this refusal. So the first spread is sort of saying, if I don't see it, it's not happening. If it doesn't happen to me, I don't care, which of course, the artist isn't being serious about, but saying there is this sense of, not everyone is experiencing the impacts equally, and so there might be times where, there's people out there that were sort of like, why don't they care about other people? And it's just something that happens. But I personally think that the lens of extinction, while I think it's supposed to unify us in being afraid or wanting to respond, I think it also kind of shuts us down into thinking that it's already over. So we have these cockroaches saying, your time is up, it's mine. And so I want to caution us from thinking of this like it's already too late mentality, because I think that's sort of something we talked about yesterday with the biosphere too, is that assumption is that it's already too late. We're planning for when we have to go to another planet.
And in that, would you say specifically that as people with privilege or power, it's easier to say that because it's a fairly abstract?
Yeah.
But as it becomes more concrete, you're not so interested in cockroaches.
I think that we're not. I think when we say, for one, I think when we say that we're in the six-mass extinction, one, we're not realizing what the other extinctions were like. We're not really thinking of the full scale of what that means. And two, it's not concrete.
It's almost, to be thinking like that is almost a symptom of your privilege.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so I'm asking this question, which is, I think we already talked about the answer, but in terms of, is this the apocalypse? Is this the six-mass extinction? Some people have also said that we're in climate gridlock, meaning that we know what we have to do to stop contributing so heavily to climate change, but no one is taking that step because we're so dependent on these industries, and the people who are in charge of them really don't want us to lose dependence. And so I think that the idea of climate gridlock, that we're really stuck, kind of goes along with this extinction. And of course, my answer is not quite and not yet. And I say that because one thing I want to bring in is that extinction, this sort of idea that we're coming towards the apocalypse, is a very privileged point of view, because the world has already ended many times for many people as well as other animals. And so, and what I mean by that is in terms of colonization, mass genocide, there are many societies where the kind of things that we're imagining as extinction have already happened, where they've experienced these near extinction or extinction moments. And so I have 2 quotes that I really find useful. Here, one is by Davi Kopinawa. I don't know if anyone has read his writing. He has this really great book called Words of a Yanomami Shaman. He worked with an anthropologist to translate his text about the Yanomami culture and how they view the world and how their world has changed as a result of colonization and capitalism. So they've been fighting against climate change, for way longer than any of us have, and sort of looking at how they continue to persevere. But the way their sort of world and cosmology works is they live on the back of a fallen sky. So the sky has already fallen, And not because of colonialism or capitalism, long before. The sky has fallen. And so they're living on the back of that fallen sky and responsible for holding the other sky up. And so he talks about the sky being kind of worn and tattered, and it's getting fragile because of the things that we're doing, because of pollution. And so everyone is sort of working to hold it up, but maybe everyone's not holding it up enough. And so, so this quote from him is talking about his ancestors saying, when he's sort of worried about this destruction, he says they're not as worried because they know very well that the sky has fallen before. And so I think that's important to recognize. And then the quote below is from Amy Césaire saying, the only thing in the world we're starting is the end of the world, for heaven's sake. And so I want to talk about that in terms of maybe when we talk about the world and when we talk about apocalypse too, we're not talking literally about the earth. A lot of times we think we are, but we're really talking about our way of life here. When we say the end of the world, it's really just the end of our specific world. And I think that that world and that way of living also forecloses on other possible futures. And so maybe there's a way to think about the end of the world, and that kind of goes back to Haraway's proposal. That's not, you know, the end of, it's not like a sort of, oh, it's already too late, but maybe how can we constructively bring about the end of our world in a way that allows for the emergence of other worlds. And I just want to kind of point out, I think both of these two people are really useful in this dialogue. As people who are writing long before the word Anthropocene was coined, I think their ideas are already sort of setting about that concept. Aimé and Suzanne Césaire, in their journal Tropiques, were writing a lot about geopoetics and already talking about humans as a geological force in the 60s and 70s. There's, I think I have it, I wonder if I have, there's another really great, there's another great quote from Césaire saying it's no longer time to be a parasite upon the earth, it's a matter of saving it, and that's in 1978, so that's long before our current, I mean, it's not a long time ago, but it's before our current sort of discourse on climate change. And so I think we really need to, in terms of bringing in for this arc, I think we need to bring in geopoetics as a theory and a grounding point. So I also want to talk about how this relates to things like queer theory and the idea of sort of no future that happens in queer theory and negativity. Because sort of like the quote from Césaire, I don't think that the idea of apocalypse isn't completely non-useful. It's only, I think, not useful when we think of it as a stopping point or an already too late point. But this sort of, it's more of a paraphrase than a quote from, this is from a really great text by Heather Davis called Toxic Progeny, where she talks about how literally plastics in our environment and the chemicals that they leach are making our bodies more queer, and not just our bodies, but of other species. And this is sometimes used as a thing, like in a very I don't know, kind of narrow, mobilizing way, where people are studying amphibians and saying like, oh, we can see the effects of this pesticide or this plastic is like making this frog that we think of as male then grow ovaries and start laying eggs, and you know, like we need to stop this. And so she kind of talks about it as it's a complicated thing when you don't want to like wholeheartedly accept these like toxic chemicals and the plastics, but we also don't want to reject what they're doing and how, you know, kind of how we're changing. So yeah, sort of, and I think that, you know, these things are already happening, and so I think maybe this quote is somewhere else, but I'm kind of thinking of like how we're changing and what we're becoming, and how we can then also approach that from a theoretical point of view. So when I say the end of the future, the no future, it's thinking of survival that's not based on sexual reproduction, and that's also more kind of thinking of social reproduction, other forms of kinship, So Naomi Klein also has this great essay where she kind of comes to thinking of kinship of the infertile, sort of herself and other species, of seeing like, okay, well these toxins have affected us in the same way, and so how can we then build kinships that aren't just based on kind of producing this sort of version of the world that we have that's so reliant on sexual reproductivity in a very specific sense. And so I brought in this, this is also not really, like not most, so none of these projects, I think maybe the Anesostrata, but for the most part, I don't want to say that these artists are like, I'm making work about the Anthropocene. But so this is a piece by, from 2011 by a Canadian artist, Anthea Black, called Queer Survival Campout Snow Cave. That was just basically the snow cave, and artists were invited, maybe it's kind of like if we were in a snow cave. Artists were invited to like kind of celebrate kinship in life, and sort of being away from both the hostile forces of nature in terms of being in a snow cave, but also of culture. And so, you know, when your culture is being condemned, you're kind of already forced to create these kinships and communities. And so how can we look to that and really bolster those forms of kinship and those forms of kind of social reproduction? And so it's sort of, it's survivalist, but not in a way I'll talk about later that's very negative. And this is another spread from Anesostrata's Sixth Mass Extinction. This is sort of, I wanted to kind of bring this up to talk more about how it is a complex situation to, you know, we neither want to endorse plastics and their resulting pollution, but we also don't want to condemn, you know, how us and other species are evolving, because we're thinking of it in a really strict sense. And there's a really great book by Alexis Shotwell called Against Purity, which I'll talk about later, but she quotes Eva Hayward in asking, is there a way to reevaluate ecological resilience, such as the gene-changing response to toxins, but to meet the future organisms that we're becoming? So is there a way to think about how, you know, we consider resilience or we consider survival that's not just kind of still producing our specific view of the world? That's kind of the dominant view. But more looking at how we change and how to kind of keep moving with that. And so this is not a full work at all. This is a really small bit of an installation that from a performance I saw by a group called Burning Orchid. But I wanted to include it because to me it kind of illustrated a lot of these things. So there were these kind of pieces of rubble that sort of show this industrialism, but also these sort of consumer capitalism. There's this like Levi's tag embedded in the rubble, which was not intentional. It was actually just there, which is really funny. But then also these like blossoming like weeds and thistles, sort of setting the scene for thriving, and for this other view of thriving that can maybe happen with all of these things that we think of as toxic. So there's no way for us to kind of get rid of this toxicity. So how do we learn to thrive with it? And so this is a quote from Nicole Seymour, kind of just wrapping up this idea of taking what she was calling queer values and caring not just about the individual or the family or one's own descendants, but about other species and persons. And so how that might be, especially because with apocalypse we tend to just think of us, or we think of like, oh, well, can I survive? Can my family survive? But of looking both to our whole species, but to other species, and kind of how do we all...
Can I ask,
Yeah.
is she saying in that same way that this queer identity, I guess, why is it specifically a queer value?
I think that a lot of, and I think this kind of happens in the Heather Davis article too, of sort of extrapolating things that maybe like happen on these other levels in queer identity and kind of exploding them outward. Thinking of like different forms of like happening from the point of different forms of community building, and then looking at how that might be applied like outside of a species.
So in some ways the way that queer culture has evolved politically and socially could be applied environmentally with success.
Yeah, that's what I mean. That's what the
Yeah.
that's what their thoughts are.
Not necessarily about queer and toxicity.
Yeah, more about looking at the ways that sort of social reproduction happens in kinship, and then kind of saying like, well, what would that look like on a like interspecies scale or an ecological scale?
The science fiction writer. Just blinked out.
Sorry, what did you say?
There's a science fiction writer that she writes a lot about these kind of relations and this kind of future.
Octavia Butler.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. It's a great person to bring into our work as well. So we've talked about these things, and so I want to then bring us to, how do we, so all of these things are kind of thinking, how do we move beyond this point of the Anthropocene, of naming? And I put the Cthulhu scene down there, but that's not where we have to go. Just kind of thinking of, okay, well, we've talked about these things, maybe where are we going, or what are we doing?
Can I ask where the word, so one reason not to go there is that it's hard to say and pronounce, but where does it,
Yeah, it's hard for me to say and
what's
pronounce.
what's the first part, what's the root, what's
So
it
the
mean?
root is
What's the root?
is Cthulhu, but it doesn't actually refer to the mythical being so
Okay.
much. Actually, people who are really into Cthulhu are like kind of like, what? She's not
Okay.
using this correctly. Like, but so her view is the way that she's trying to use it or spin it is about these like multi-species flourishing.
Okay.
Humans being part of a sort of network of lots of other beings. Yeah. But so I'm interested in us looking beyond the sort of feeling of climate gridlock and apocalypse and thinking about, if there's a way to get from our current place of capitalism, institutionalized racism, toxicity, and where we could go. And so I'm going to then talk a lot about, I'm going to bring in more works of visual art, and it's not that they're solutions, it's just maybe they're like ways to kind of brainstorm and think about things. Also, am I going too slow? Are you guys feeling okay? Because there's a lot of stuff. So then I want to kind of bring this into another kind of way of thinking of the Anthropocene, because I also am not that interested in it being accepted as an official epoch. I think it's more of a tool for critical thinking. And so there's a really great book by Joanna Zielinska called Minimal Ethics for the Anthropocene. And it's free. You can read it on the computer, download it. It's cool. Yeah.
What's her name?
It's really tiny. It's Joanna Zielinska. Yeah. But she sort of wrote this calling the Anthropocene, saying it's really a crisis in critical thinking, because we tend to think of climate change or something this big as a new epoch and then like shut down. So then we see all these responses kind of similar to, I'm going to keep calling on the Biosphere 2 thing of this like solutionism, kind of thinking like, okay, well, what's the solution? I'm not even going to really think about the problem. I'm just going to go straight to a solution, which risks kind of doing the same type of thing we've been doing. As well as this kind of feeling of heroicism of like, oh, we're going to save the planet. It's not really just, it's not like we're saving the planet. It's like, no, we're trying to save ourselves. I think we need to think about, we're also hopefully trying to save other species, but we tend to be a little narrow-minded. And so she proposes the idea of non-instrumental modes of thinking, which may seem to some people in terms of climate change really terrible, like the idea of like, I'm going to think, but I'm not just trying to come up with a solution. But I think it's important because we have to really dwell on and think through what the problem is to be able to solve it, or to even try to solve it. Otherwise, we end up with things like geoengineering or planning to build a colony on Mars, and we're just kind of like saying like, too bad, it's too late. And I also just wanted to then to bring up, this is, I think her concept is similar to earlier things, like Simone Weil's idea of creative attention, of paying attention to what's not there or what's not expressed. And so this also relates to the concept, which I feel like this gets talked about a lot, Timothy Morton's concept of dark ecology. or he's bringing up ideas of hesitation, uncertainty, irony, and thoughtfulness, of ways of approaching these thoughts and these things, so that it's okay to be uncertain or to hesitate. Zelenska also brings up this idea of, she says that this crisis in critical thinking requires a different mode of philosophizing, one that produces ideas with things and events rather than just with words. And so I feel that a lot of the work that I'll talk about is sort of doing this philosophy and kind of producing these kind of test scenarios or thought experiments. And a lot of this has to do with people have called problems of scale. So the idea of thinking like, okay, I have this problem, oh, I've made the solution, it's all, this covers everything. And then if we're not considering the full scale of the problem and all of the effects of climate change, then we're really not, these solutions don't actually solve the problem, they may make it worse. And so then I want to talk about what the role of art might be, and I kind of mentioned this a lot already, but the idea of what I think, and I say this just because I've been in situations where there are like climate scientists working with artists, and they're like, oh, okay, you're going to like illustrate my theories, and it's going to be great, and you'll like make it look nice, and people will want to like listen. And that's, as many of us know, that's not really what art does. Art doesn't really solve problems or pose solutions. It really kind of digs into problems, or at least I think it does. So I think that to me, the work we'll discuss is really helpful in terms of this non-instrumental mode. So a way to ask more questions, we might start up with one and then we have more, and to kind of help us have discussions that otherwise might seem really dark and depressing. And I think for us that's easy, but not for everyone. And then also conducting these thought experiments that might, just in theory seem too radical. So looking at something that's concrete. And so I'm...
And clarifying again, provoking these dark discussions, it's basically allowing ourselves to hang in the I don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
In the space of vulnerability and confusion and without defending back.
Yeah. And so we're not going to be, I'm not going to propose any solutions. I'm just going to put that out there. We're not going to solve any problems during this talk. We're just going to end up with more questions. We might be really like.
Just as a comment, you are formulating much better than many ecologists. You are formulating the point much better than many ecologists of the world.
You also are in a good mood while you do this, which is it's a sign that something's going right.
We're not going to solve any problems. There's also, I've heard people propose. I was at a conference once where it was it was mostly activists, and then there's randomly this like economist grad student, and then like a few artists. And he got up and gave a presentation on eco-depression and how when they survey students who like that, we actually just shouldn't even talk about environmental problems because then people become depressed. And that's like sort of what I'm trying to battle is like, no, we need to talk about these things. So I think there's a way to do it where we don't just become depressed and shut down. Yeah, it was a really interesting presentation. It was like, okay.
That's right.
So,
it's like the show. Like that.
It's fine if we get really down, but we'll try to, I think that we'll keep going. And so I'm not reading my script, so some of these things are just not coming up in like a flow, but this, so one thing I do think happens in art, so I'll say that the Anthropocene has entered the sort of discourse of arts for a while now. And it's always, and also because I'm an artist, and it's not a concept that I work with in my work, but just thinking of like, what does that do? Is that good or is that bad or is that neither? Because I think we do want to be critical of taking something and then, what happens when it starts being, when it starts coming up all the time in an art context. And so I think one thing that happens in exhibitions or in individual works is that we start to build these narratives of what the Anthropocene is. And And also those are being communicated with people that aren't maybe familiar with where the term came from. And so I think it's important to look at those narratives and what they are. And so I think of course the main reason that people are using this term, including myself and others, is the idea of promoting awareness. And that comes from the naming of it. Paul Cruch and his team were really interested in a way to make people think about the human impact of climate change. But then, of course, after promoting awareness, we then start to develop narratives. And so I think there's both constructive narratives and destructive ones. And I think the ones that are constructive, like I said, are the ones that let us dwell on this moment of uncertainty. But then there are also, I think, and we only keep developing in this one trajectory. And so I think taking a moment to have these speculative possible futures of looking like, oh, well, what if instead we stopped? Because often we think like, oh, we keep developing or we just stop. So sort of what if we develop in a different way, or we, instead of thinking of altering our environment, which is what geoengineering does and wants to do in terms of climate change, we think about altering ourselves, either in a technological sense or, in this idea of biohacking, but also just in how we live. So it's like sort of thinking of like these are design proposals, but they're not necessarily just about surviving quickly through. It's sort of like changing the way that I think these ways of thinking about energy also end up affecting things like the ethics of a society, the way that a society is structured. This is another project by Doon and Raby called Foragers, where they made these devices that would be used to glean nutritional value from urban environments in response to food shortages. So these people are kind of going around and like sucking up and digesting, similar to the Pinarioldas thing with the plastic, of like thinking of like ways of these other organs that can digest our environment. So then maybe looking at what's already happening and how we can survive off of that. And then this is another project by them called Is This Your Future? Which was all centered around small children who had to produce energy for their families. And a lot of them are disturbing. There's one that's like they kind of raise these gerbils and they use their blood to kind of run. I mean, it's like disturbing to us, I think. A lot of times we're like, oh, weird. So this is like a birthday card in one of these like scenarios of like, you're now a hydrogen producer, you have to produce this much hydrogen for your family. But kind of thinking of like, and we tend to think of our energy as something that like comes to us, that we like produce out there and then it comes to us. And this is more thinking of personally how we produce energy. And it was, children, the scenarios were all for children aged 7 to 14. But I think one thing I think this challenges, and maybe this image doesn't do it so much as some of the kind of more strange ones, is it challenges us to think about the type of ethics and subjectivities that our current technologies produce in us, as well as our reliance on fossil fuels. I think maybe that's something we don't think about as much. But we are really sort of conditioned around these things that we use and how we live, and kind of thinking of like, well, if we start to change these little things, what else might that change? And so this next section is about living, but also about dying. And then thinking about the materiality of the body and how we position ourselves in this broader system. So this is a proposal. These artists were actually students of the last artist I talked about, or designers, James Auger and Jimmy Luzo, for a project called Afterlife, which is using a microbial fuel cell to sort of use the organic matter of the human body as energy. So it's meant, so after someone passes away, you kind of use them. They live on as something that powers another object. And I thought that this was a really interesting proposal because it takes on also this aspect of animism. People start to kind of view the object as being, their loved one that has passed away. And then these are letters from people writing what they would choose to power with their body. And so some of them are very kind of funny. The one is from one of the designer's wife saying he always told her to brush her teeth via toothbrush. And this is a project actually in response to that project by two artists, Ayur Dalama and Fido Segura. That's also kind of using an urn with a microbial fuel cell, but this one is meant to be carried on the back of a loved one of the deceased, and then it's supposed to, again, these are speculative, so they're not, but they're usually presented, both of these, in design contexts, where they're presented along things that are like really practical, and so then you see this kind of setup of like afterlife battery, and there's a coffin with a fuel cell underneath, which I think is like, I think it's a good way to position work. But so this one, the artist says that it's supposed to send the DNA code, sort of transmitting it back into the air, which I thought was an interesting way to also kind of bring in this idea of lineage and cross-generational communication. And then kind of going from these two artists in this series also made this sort of wearable ecosystem. I think these are both maybe projects when they were students, so the documentation's a little in process. But kind of thinking also then of like sort of, I'm interested in both of their projects that have to do with this carrying and sort of what it means to then know that you're carrying these other ecosystems on your back. And I don't know if anyone has heard of J-Rim Lee's project. This is a still from a TED talk she gave called My Mushroom Burial Suit back in 2011. And so she is proposing and has been working on this thing called the Infinity Burial Project, where she talks about the toxins that are in the environment and how they're also in our body. And then, of course, when we die, they are released back. And that's something I feel like doesn't, or at least I hadn't thought about that much before seeing her talk back in 2011. And so thinking of like dying isn't just because sometimes I think we're like, okay, then we die. It's like, well, then we die and other stuff continues to happen. So, you know, these things go into our bodies and then come out. And so she's interested in ideas to remediate that. And so this is a proposal for this burial suit where she started growing these mushroom spores that would both eat the human body and decompose it, but also at the same time remediate toxins. And of course, like, you know, she gives this talk and everyone thinks she's crazy. But it's, you know, it's actually a very practical idea. But you would wear this suit which has these mushroom spores embroidered in it. And then you would also, here, I'll go back for a second. You would also eat these capsules to kind of help your body decompose and remediate. So you would sort of know that you were dying, and then you would take these steps. One thing I really was drawn to about this project is, again, thinking of not the body and the environment as separate, and then also proposing something that seems a little uncomfortable. It's not just about thinking that we die and it's okay, but thinking what happens after and how we continue to interact. I think it's gone in a really weird direction, so I wanted to follow up on it. I tried to visit her website like maybe in the last year, and it's now this super corporate looking company that she's gotten funding and developed this line of products. And I don't think that makes it like not useful.
Is it a real company?
It is a real, no, it's a real company. It's a real company.
Okay.
She was given funding and it's a real company. But it's only for like really rich people.
Right.
And it has this really, I think the rhetoric of the project has changed completely, where it used to really be about, she was saying it's about taking responsibility for like, not thinking of like environmental stewardship in this sort of kind of like out there way, but taking responsibility. But now it's kind of become this like personal purity responsibility thing that I think is really problematic in terms of like, sort of like a lot of the rhetoric is sort of saying like, oh, if you buy this, you absolve your guilt. Like you no longer, you know that you're like not continuing to pollute.
But isn't it very, I mean, that's why she would be invited to TED.
Yeah.
Because she's already that type of person, thinking of that,
Yeah.
like in an app kind of.
Well, in her
spreading
TED talk, she seems like, and they kind of seem like, who the hell is this? Like, you're so weird. What are you talking about? And she seems like a really like great intervention to TED, but then she kind of ends up. It kind of ends up in the same.
TED.
Yeah. And so I kind of follow up on this I want to talk about this idea of purity and sort of. I think this idea that then we each can personally control and resolve our own impact is problematic. One, because people have different opportunities to do that. People are affected differently. If we start to think of, it's kind of a similar thing that's happening with healthcare in the U.S., where like some politicians like, oh, people who need health insurance are just living bad lives. Like, because it's some moral thing that they do that they, not that, oh, I put an industrial waste site next to them and now they're sick more or something. So I think that I'm really cautious and kind of sad about. I think it's great that there will be less toxins leaching back into the environment from the few people who get to use this, but I'm sort of worried about where it's gone. And so this next section, and we're almost at the end, this is number 4, is called Against Purity. This is kind of short, but I just kind of want to talk about sort of against, and Against Purity is taken from, again, this book I mentioned by Alexis Shotwell, that's really great. But kind of so, okay, like how do we then talk about this? Obviously we want to remediate toxins, but it's not possible for all of us, and it's not possible, and there's no such thing as, Alexis Shotwell kind of points out, there's no such thing as this idea of purity. We sort of have, and it's a very like sort of colonial sort of, I think it has a lot of underlying white supremacy of thinking like, oh, we can just be completely pure, I can buy only organic food and I can just wash all the toxins out of me. And it's this one idea of purity that, for one, not everyone has access to, and it's not ever possible. And so how can we embrace and respond to our world in its current state of toxicity, and sort of looking at what is happening, what we have. And so I wanted to pull on 2 artists who I think his work really expresses this intermingling of what we tend to kind of separate as natural and toxic and artificial. This is a project that I really love by Edgar Heap of Birds. He was asked to kind of do a project about the history of this river, and his response was a series of signs about things that the river knows and what it's come into contact with throughout its life. And so this is one of the signs that kind of talks about, again, I'm sort of thinking these things we think of as natural, we're like, oh, and, you know, other animals. But then also colonization and sort of more. And then, and there's many signs, these are just 3 I kind of picked out. And then also these toxins and chemicals. So kind of thinking of, you know, it's not one or the other. It's not like we get back to this sort of natural moment. But we have all of these things going on. And we, at this point, I think it's maybe, I don't mean it in this sort of it's too late way, but we have to kind of reckon with all of the things that we have. And recognize that the river is not just like this sort of beautiful natural river, but it's also experienced all these other layers, and those things continue to live in it. And then this is a project by an artist, Wawina Rosa, who lives in Manila. And it's a project called Huntergatherer Area, and it looks, I think, like kind of like innocent and beautiful at first. But what it is, and it's, I mean, I don't know what I mean by innocent, but like you're like, terrarium, it's so nice. But she kind of gathered these foragers around the city, including herself, to kind of go out into Metro Manila, which is like just a crazy environment in terms of like different sort of constructions and developments going on, and kind of collect these rocks and soil and plants that are growing in places that are sort of looking at like there's growth that's happening in what we would consider not to be natural spaces. And so if you read if you can read the text, she has the people who are collecting with her note where they gathered things from. So there's concrete from Shumart, which is like their biggest mall. And then some of it is like, there's like private gardens, like sort of designated natural sites, but also things taken from landfills. And sort of, so I think one thing I find interesting about this project is she's not just kind of putting forth this one thing as like being natural, but looking at what that means at this day in terms of all these different layers of things intermingling and growing together. And then I know we're in a hurry. So our last section is, I want to kind of go back, kind of jumping back to the beginning in terms of the idea of temporality, because that's one of the most confusing things when talking about the Anthropocene, is the idea that it's the naming of something that we're already in and that has already been happening. But it doesn't necessarily have to be our future, and sort of thinking about where we are in this trajectory, whether it's linear or cyclical. And so I'm interested to talk about these other forms of temporality as a way of dealing with these issues. And then also the idea of finding agency over our futures, as well as our presence. So this is a project that's still kind of in process by Maureen Aliari. Some of you might know of her work from the 3D Additivist Manifesto that she did. But this is her current project called She Who Sees the Unknown. And it's like a project that hasn't come to full fruition yet, so I'm just showing kind of some slides that she has up on her website. But I think it's interesting that she's looking at the history of these sort of like dark goddesses. And she calls this project digital colonialism and refiguring as a form of feminism and activist practice. So she's using 3D printers and scanners, but also research into dark goddesses and monsters and female figures from Middle Eastern origin to kind of devise these speculative narratives. And this is like one shot. So she did an installation of this project, which has these images and objects, and then also these sort of research files. And I just really love the headings in terms of like decolonize, but also talisman, reimagining, alternatives, fever, and sort of pulling in. So I think this project, to me, makes me think of the idea of like pulling in all these different things we have and all these different legacies that may be negative and may be positive, and kind of looking at where we are and where we can go. And then this project is called The Rift. And it's related to, this is by the same artist who did the Meta Urn and the sort of wearable ecosystem in Brooklyn. I don't know if you recognize that it's in Brooklyn. What?
I'm not from the future. No, I'm wondering.
Yeah. And so this is also kind of in relation to a project by an artist, Christina Nadell, called The Afronauts, but looking at the history of the African space program. But this is a sort of like fictional narrative that he makes about kind of being this astronaut from the future, traveling back in time to collect these specimens and artifacts of a society that has collapsed. So he's looking at like coming back to our society as it is now, as if from the future, and kind of collecting these things to analyze what happened, which I think is an interesting approach for us also in thinking of, we're always thinking of like moving up and forward into the unknown, but of coming back from the, what to us is the unknown, and kind of looking around.
Grace, this was your vision.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's so many, you should watch this video because it's really beautiful. But, and then this is a project that I think is both like kind of enacting solutions in a way that I actually think is good and useful, but also sort of dwelling and doing thought experiments, which is the Community Futures Lab by this group called Black Quantum Futurism, which is Rashida Phillips, who's both an artist and a housing attorney and lawyer. So she has this very kind of on-the-ground approach, and Kamea Ayu. And so this is one of their many projects, but this was an actual space in Philadelphia that was sort of in a community, one that they both lived in, but that was also experiencing a lot of gentrification and destruction at the same time. And so looking at creating a space for a community to come together and find agency over their future. And so they don't have a lot of pictures online because they mostly do these like in-person workshops. They're not visual artists. But so this is the only real picture I could find of like their space. It's very cutesy because it's from like a magazine article. But I saw Rashida Phillips talk a couple times, and if you ever get a chance to listen or see that, I recommend it. But so one of the things that they do are these sort of like workshops on temporality and on event mapping, quantum event mapping. And so Rashida brings in looking at time traditions that don't move in a sort of like linear forward sense, and kind of looking at the ways that kind of the future can kind of like move back through the present towards the past. So she's looking at some African cultural traditions where the future, instead of us just thinking like, now we're like, oh, we don't know what's coming, we just move forward, but then of looking at how things come down and also change the way we see the present and the past, and the way that those things can continue to affect each other. So one thing that participants do is they map a future event as if it's already happened and they're remembering it. And then they map a past event as if it's new and they're just walking into it and kind of experiencing what they see. And then you kind of bridge those two things together to find what's the now moment, which is where you have the agency to kind of bring those moments or create change. And a lot of her work, and I think it comes out of her work as a housing rights lawyer, is thinking of, you know, oftentimes there's many of us who don't feel that we have agency over our future, and it's kind of like, it's an important question, both in terms of like earlier, like who this anthropos is, but also who feels that they have agency over their future, and who feels that they can really contribute to what their life ends up like. And a lot of times we foreclose those forms of agency to a lot of people. And so finding a way to take agency again over both your present and then also your future. So I think this project is really great in terms of reconsidering temporality in these kind of like mass disasters. But yeah, I know.
So I think.
And we're over. So that's my end. I know it's a bad question mark because we didn't solve any problems, but there we are. Okay.
Amazing.
Great.
So I suggest for the discussion we do it over lunch. This book is going to be ready with it. And yeah, that was really interesting.
Brilliant. Great.
Let's keep talking.
Yeah.
Yeah.